The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 21st chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
After he appeared to his followers in Jerusalem, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat. You will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this he said to him, "Follow me." The Gospel of the Lord. So contrary to what many people may think by having watched my Facebook posts while I was on sabbatical, I did actually do things other than ski. Mostly at night when the slopes were closed because they didn't have night skiing where I was. And what I was doing at night when I was not skiing was reading books. And I was trying to focus my reading on books that talked about how our society and how our church has radically and systemically changed, or the culture, the context in which we live has radically and systemically changed in the last couple of decades. And so I read a lot of books that were actually pretty helpful, but the last one that I read was a book entitled Canoeing the Mountains, which seems to make no sense. How do you canoe in the mountains? And it's written by a Presbyterian minister named Todd Bolsinger. And he wrote this book because he said the context in which we're trying to live as faithful Christian communities has changed radically. And if we keep trying to do things the same old way, it's just not going to work. So he called this book Canoeing the Mountains because his central analogy was the Lewis and Clark expedition. So if you remember your American history, Lewis and Clark were these two explorers who were sent by Thomas Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Purchase in the very first years of the 19th century. Their job was to explore all the way west from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean and hopefully to find a water route that everybody believed existed from the Mississippi River over the Pacific Ocean, so it would be great for trade and expand everything and stuff like that. So Lewis and Clark gathered up all their supplies and all of their team, loaded it into canoes, and began canoeing up the Missouri River. And they paddled up the Missouri River for quite a long time, and everything went fine until they suddenly saw the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, and the river dried up. And it was at that moment that they realized, Canoeing's not going to work anymore. If we're going to keep moving forward, we have to find a different way. But trying to find and wrap your brain around the fact that you have to live and move in a different way is radically disorienting. It's unlike anything you have ever done before, and that was sort of the point that the author was making in this book. And he says, you know, facing a new reality and a new kind of way is really hard. And it's disorienting because it is so different. And one of his central observations in the book is that he says, when we get to moments of deep disorientation, we often try to reorient around old ways of doing things. We go back to what we know how to do. We keep canoeing, even though there is no river. It's just natural to want to go back to what we know how to do. And it struck me that that is exactly what the disciples do in today's gospel reading. They too had been through weeks of disorientation. They had traveled with Jesus to Jerusalem. Jesus had been suddenly and violently killed, and that would have been disorienting enough. But then, 3 days later, Jesus appears alive, and he shows that he's risen, and then he's gone. And then a week later, he appears again, and then he's gone. And what are they to make of all this? I mean, they're still in Jerusalem, a long ways away. So what do? Well, they go home. They go home to Galilee, and they go, now what? Now what do we do? What do we do with this new situation that we find ourselves in? Well, Peter decides, let's do what we've always done. I'm going fishing, says Peter. Yeah, we know how to do that, say the rest. So they go along. And they all get into the boat, and they return to doing what they knew how to do before they knew Jesus. They go fishing. And it's in the midst of this old way of doing things that Jesus appears again and meets them. He calls to them from the shore. He does something miraculous even in the midst of their old way of doing things. And he prods them forward to follow in new ways. I think that this is an important thing to remember when we consider the resurrection of Jesus. You know, for most of us, the resurrection is the predictable end of the gospel story. We've heard it all before. The end of the story is Jesus is risen, and we so domesticate that message that it seems to us that the disciples, as soon as they see Jesus alive again, want to run around and tell everybody, woo! Jesus is risen, Lent is over, yay! Just like for us. You know, but even that great good news was terribly disorienting for them. What were they supposed to do with this? Because in fact, even when they knew it was great news, it was still disorienting. Even when they knew it was going to change their lives, they didn't know how. Even when they knew Jesus wanted them to move in some kind of new way, how? Where? We got no template for what it means to live in this new way. And so today's story is really an important part of the resurrection narrative, because it reminds us that Jesus' resurrection is a change not only in Jesus' life, but it changes our lives as well. And it's also important because it reminds us of how Jesus is working in our lives when we face times of deep confusion and deep disorientation. And those times of deep disorientation happen to us, frankly, way more than I would like to admit. They can be times of great pain and sadness, or even times of great joy and possibility. They can happen to us personally or communally. And like the resurrection or the Rocky Mountains, they make us face a new and different reality, which is going to cause us to live forward in an entirely different way. So it's good to look at exactly what Jesus did for his first disciples so we can be alert to maybe what Jesus is doing in our lives when we face times of deep disorientation. So what did Jesus do in this now third time in John's Gospel that he appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead? Well, there's lots and lots of stuff going on in this story. But it seems to me that the very first thing that Jesus did was he met the disciples where they were, even in the midst of their deep disorientation, and even when they were trying to go back to the old way of doing things. Jesus didn't berate them for this. He didn't ask them why they were fishing or what they were doing back home in Galilee. Instead, he called them ashore, and the first thing he did was he fed them breakfast. He knew that they were confused, they were disoriented, they needed physical and spiritual nourishment, and part of what he did was he just sat there with them in the midst of their confusion. And sometimes that's the most important thing, we need when we're in times of disoriented, and we just don't know what's going on, which end is up in our lives. We need people to just sit with us, to be with us, to know that we're not alone. And that's the first thing Jesus does in this story for his disciples. But he also calls them to focus. When Jesus calls them and keeps saying, "Follow me," which is not a new thing, it's an old thing. When he says, "Follow me," what he's doing is he's calling them to focus on the things that he's taught them and the new things that he's doing in their lives. One of the things about being disoriented is, you just don't know which end is up. You don't know what to look for, what to focus on. And in transforming that catch of fish from 0 to 153, what Jesus is doing is showing them that even in the midst of trying to do things the old way, God has something new for them in mind. That they should be looking for and focusing on the new things that Jesus is doing in their lives, and not just trying to live their lives on autopilot, which is the sort of natural thing we want to do when we're feeling kind of disoriented and confused. He calls them to do that. And in doing that, he's also implicitly promising them that as they look for these new things and they follow him into the future, that he's going to be there with them. See, the thing with John's Gospel, particularly, is that Jesus never ascends in the way he does in Luke's Gospel, where he goes out to the mountaintop and he's lifted up into heaven, and that's where Jesus is. Jesus just sort of appears and disappears throughout the story. And the last scene we have in John's Gospel is Jesus on the beach saying, "Follow me." And then where does he go? And the idea, at least in John's Gospel, is that Jesus is always around them, is always with them. Sometimes they can see him, but usually not. But he's always going to be in front of them in the future. He's always going to be leading them in the future. That's when he says, "Follow me," it's not go over there and I'll see you in heaven when you die. It's I'm actually going to be out there helping you through all of this confusing future that you don't know what it holds. It will not always be fun and easy. Because the things he says to Peter, John says at the end, he says, in retrospect, we can see he said this because he indicated the kind of death Peter was going to die to glorify God. That was not fun, that was not easy, but it's Jesus' promise that even when things, and maybe especially when things are not fun and easy, Jesus is going to be out there with us into the future, no matter what the future holds. I am pretty sure that those first disciples of Jesus would have liked Jesus to have given them a blueprint of exactly what this future would look like, because they were kind of disoriented. They probably would have liked a template to figure out what they were supposed to do and what they were supposed to say and how they were supposed to act. I love patterns. Give me the pattern and I will follow it. And at least they seem to have wanted a timeline about how long this was all going to take. When are you coming back? And maybe let us go back to the old ways of doing things. At least those are the kinds of things that I want when I face disorientation in my life. Maybe it's the same for you. Unfortunately, Jesus didn't give his disciples any of those things. Instead, he showed them that he would be with them in the midst of the disorientation and confusion in their lives. He called them to stay focused on what he had taught them and what he had shown them, so they could live boldly into the future. And he promised them that he would be with them in the future, no matter what the future held. See, those are the same promises that Jesus gives to us also, especially when we face times of deep disorientation and confusion in our lives. Jesus promises us that we will never be alone in our disorientation. Jesus is continually working to show us his presence in our lives so that we can focus on the new things God is doing instead of just relying on autopilot. And most of all, Jesus is promising us also that He's always going to be there with us into the future, showing us that God holds the future in His hands, no matter where that future leads us.